American has the strongest military strategies and strength in the world from 1942 till date. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city and your country. And please subscribe, like, and share this video so we can push this story to more people across the world and together rewrite the false history many of us were taught. In war, there are armies that fight, and there are nations that build a power that decides who survives. America did not become the strongest military force in the world in one day, and it did not happen because it had the bravest soldiers alone. It happened because, in one terrifying moment of history, a sleeping industrial giant opened its eyes and decided it would never again be caught weak. By 1942, the world was already burning. Europe was bleeding. Asia was collapsing into chaos. Empires that once looked immortal were trembling. Cities were turning to ash. Oceans had become hunting grounds. The old order of the world was dying in real time. And then came the strike that changed everything. Pearl Harbor. That attack was not just a military blow. It was a psychological explosion. It shook the United States so deeply that what came after was not just retaliation. It was transformation. America did not simply prepare for war. America rebuilt itself into a machine of war so vast, so disciplined, and so terrifyingly efficient that by the end of the Second World War, it had become something the world had never seen before. Not just a nation with an army, but a civilization organized for military supremacy. In the early days of the war, the United States was not yet the unstoppable force many imagine today. It had resources, yes. It had ambition, yes. But it had not yet fully become the war beast history would remember. Then something extraordinary happened. American factories stopped behaving like ordinary factories and began to function like arsenals of destiny. Car companies started producing tanks. Civilian assembly lines began building bombers. Shipyards worked like they were racing against the end of the world. Steel, rubber, oil, aluminum, copper, engines, rifles, ammunition, uniforms, radios, trucks, artillery, warships, aircraft. Everything began pouring out at a speed that stunned even America's allies. While much of the world was being bombed into exhaustion, the United States sat behind two vast oceans and turned geography into an advantage. It became the one great industrial fortress the enemy could not reach. And from that fortress came a flood of power. The numbers alone sounded unreal. Thousands of aircraft, thousands of tanks, thousands of ships, millions of rifles, mountains of ammunition, entire floating fleets, endless convoys, endless fuel, endless food, endless replacement parts, endless men. The war was no longer just about courage in battle. It became about who could sustain violence longer, deeper, and more intelligently. And in that game, America became nearly impossible to match. But raw production alone does not win world wars. Many nations can build weapons. Fewer can move them across oceans, coordinate them across continents, and deliver them at the exact time and place they are needed. That is where America began to reveal what would become its greatest military superpower: logistics. Logistics is not glamorous. It does not look heroic on movie posters. It is not a dramatic battlefield charge. But it is often the invisible hand that decides victory. A soldier can be brave, but if he has no fuel, no food, no ammunition, no medical support, and no transport, bravery becomes a funeral. America understood this faster and more completely than almost anyone else. So it built a military system not just to fight, but to sustain fighting. It built ports, supply routes, repair networks, maintenance depots, floating hospitals, transport fleets, engineering corps, communication systems, and command structures so massive that war itself became an organized industry. This was not chaos. This was precision. Every crate mattered, every landing strip mattered, every gallon of fuel mattered, every mile of ocean mattered. By the time American forces landed in North Africa, fought across the Pacific, and prepared for the liberation of Europe, they were no longer just troops. They were the visible edge of a machine that could strike, resupply, repair, and strike again. That machine became one of the greatest military advantages in modern history. Then came another evolution, combined arms warfare. This idea sounds simple, but it changed everything. Instead of treating the Army, Navy, and Air Force as separate giants, stumbling in different directions, America learned how to make them operate like one coordinated weapon. Aircraft would soften targets. Naval guns would support landings. Infantry would advance under armored protection. Engineers would clear obstacles. Intelligence would identify weaknesses. Radio communication would keep units connected. Artillery would break resistance. Supply lines would keep momentum alive. This was not random violence. This was orchestration. The battlefield became a living system. And the United States became increasingly skilled at running that system at scale. During island hopping in the Pacific, this mattered. During the march toward Germany, this mattered. During every amphibious landing, this mattered. One branch alone could achieve something, but together they could overwhelm. That lesson, learned in blood during the Second World War, would become one of the central pillars of American military power for the next 80 years. Yet even that was not the final secret. Because behind the visible war was a hidden war, the war of science. This was where America began to separate itself from not just its enemies, but from history itself. Radar, advanced bombers, better engines, cryptography, industrial chemistry, naval engineering, long-range aviation, strategic targeting. The modern battlefield was becoming a laboratory of death and invention. And America, with its universities, scientists, engineers, private industry, and government funding, began fusing knowledge with violence in a way that changed the future forever. Then came the Manhattan Project. In hidden laboratories and guarded compounds, under immense secrecy, America was building something no empire in history had ever possessed. Not a better rifle, not a stronger tank, not a larger battleship. It was building the power to destroy cities in one strike. The atomic bomb did not merely end a chapter of war. It opened a new age of fear. When the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world saw something it could never unsee. The meaning of military power had changed. For the first time in human history, one nation possessed a weapon that could erase urban life in seconds. At that moment, America was not just winning a war. It was stepping into a terrifying new category of power, the only nuclear power on Earth. That fact alone made the rest of the world look at Washington with a mixture of awe, fear, dependence, and dread. But if you look closely, the true reason America emerged from 1945 so dominant was not simply that it had won. It was that it had learned. It had learned how to mobilize an economy for total war. It had learned how to integrate industry, science, intelligence, logistics, and battlefield coordination. It had learned how to command oceans. It had learned how to fight on multiple continents at once. It had learned how to innovate faster than its enemies could adapt. And perhaps most importantly, it had learned that military power was not only about defending borders. It was about shaping the world before threats could reach home. That idea would become one of the most important and controversial foundations of American grand strategy. The United States would not wait quietly behind its shores anymore. It would build reach. It would build presence. It would build deterrence. It would build alliances. It would build systems. It would build a military capable of touching almost any point on Earth. But in 1945, that future still looked uncertain. The war had ended, yes, but peace did not arrive in the way many hoped. Another shadow was already rising: the Soviet Union. One giant war had just ended, and already another struggle was forming, colder, deeper, more ideological, and potentially even more dangerous. The alliance of necessity between America and the Soviet Union was collapsing almost as soon as the Nazi threat disappeared. The world was splitting into camps, one side backed by Washington, the other by Moscow. And in this new kind of conflict, the rules were different. Massive armies still mattered, but now so did missiles, spies, propaganda, economics, satellites, nuclear submarines, proxy wars, and strategic positioning. America would have to evolve again, or risk losing the very dominance it had just built. But before that next chapter could begin, the foundation had already been laid. 1942 to 1945 was not just a wartime period. It was the birth of the modern American military system. Everything that came later, the aircraft carriers, the global bases, the stealth bombers, the intelligence networks, the precision strikes, the satellite warfare, the drone age, the cyber battlefield, the nuclear triad, the alliance structure, all of it grew from the furnace of those years. And yet, even at its birth, there was a dark contradiction hiding inside the power. America could build the strongest war machine on Earth, but strength alone would never guarantee wisdom. It could win conventional wars, but could it control what came after victory? It could destroy armies, but could it shape broken societies? It could project force across the globe, but could it always understand the worlds it entered? Those questions would haunt every generation after 1945. But at the end of the Second World War, few people were thinking about future mistakes. What they saw was simple and overwhelming. A nation had entered the war bruised, angry, and uncertain, and emerged as the arsenal of democracy, the master of industrial war, the architect of unprecedented destruction, and the strongest military power the modern world had ever known. The machine had awakened. And once awakened, it would never truly go back to sleep. Because what America discovered in those years was not only how to fight wars. It discovered how to build a system so powerful that war itself could become part of its global identity. And the world, whether it liked it or not, was now entering the American military age. When the guns of the Second World War finally went silent, many believed the nightmare was over. They were wrong. The deadliest war in human history had ended. But peace did not arrive like a sunrise. It arrived like a shadow, quiet, tense, suspicious, and full of weapons. The next great struggle would not begin with a formal declaration. It would begin with fear. And in that fear, America would transform again, from a victorious wartime giant into the central military power of an entirely new world order. This was the beginning of the Cold War, and unlike the World War that came before it, this conflict would not be fought only with armies on open battlefields. It would be fought with ideology, influence, technology, nuclear terror, espionage, alliances, covert operations, and psychological pressure. It would be a war of positioning, patience, and readiness. It would be a war where the most powerful military was not always the one that fired first, but the one that could make the other side too afraid to move. And in this dangerous new age, America began building something even more formidable than the war machine of 1945. It began building permanent global military supremacy. The new enemy was the Soviet Union. It had emerged from the war bloodied but powerful, with vast armies, enormous territorial influence, and a ruthless political system that frightened the West. Soviet forces dominated Eastern Europe. Communist movements were spreading. Revolutions, coups, and civil wars threatened to pull entire regions into Moscow's orbit. To American leaders, this was not just a political problem. It was an existential one. If the Soviet Union kept expanding, then one day the balance of global power might tip permanently. So Washington adopted a strategy that would define its military behavior for decades: containment. Containment was simple in theory and brutal in practice. The United States would oppose communist expansion anywhere. It believed Soviet influence was growing. It would build alliances, support friendly governments, position forces abroad, and if necessary, fight wars far from home to stop the spread. This was a massive strategic shift. America was no longer just defending its territory. It was now defending a global system. And to do that, it needed not only strength but reach. So it began placing military power across the world like pieces on a giant chessboard. Bases in Europe, bases in Asia, naval fleets in key oceans, airfields in strategic corridors, listening posts, supply hubs, intelligence stations. Forward deployment became a way of life. The message was clear. The United States would not wait for danger to arrive at its shores. It would meet danger far away before it had a chance to grow. This made America more powerful than ever before, but it also locked the country into a permanent state of military readiness. Then came the nuclear nightmare. In the final years of the Second World War, America had been the only nation with atomic weapons. That monopoly did not last. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its own atomic bomb. Suddenly, the world entered a new and horrifying reality. The two strongest powers on Earth now had the ability to destroy each other, and eventually, to destroy much of humanity. This changed military strategy forever. Before, victory meant defeating the enemy in battle. Now, total victory could also mean total annihilation. America responded by pouring enormous resources into strategic deterrence. If war could no longer be safely won, then perhaps it could be prevented through fear. That meant building not just a few nuclear weapons, but a vast and survivable nuclear arsenal. Bombers that could strike across continent, missiles that could launch in minutes, submarines hidden beneath the sea, waiting silently with apocalyptic force. This became known as the nuclear triad: land-based missiles, strategic bombers, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. The idea was terrifying, but effective. Even if one part was destroyed, the other two could retaliate. No enemy could hope to wipe out America's ability to strike back. And because of that, no rational enemy could launch first without risking its own destruction. This was not peace. This was armed suspense on a planetary scale. But America did not rely on nuclear power alone. It also understood that conventional military strength still mattered. Nuclear weapons could deter a superpower war, but they were useless for handling every crisis, uprising, border clash, or regional conflict. So the United States continued modernizing its conventional forces with remarkable speed. It built better tanks, faster jets, more advanced aircraft carriers, improved artillery, stronger logistics systems, and more flexible command structures. It invested heavily in military education, planning, wargaming, doctrine, and intelligence. It studied not just how to win the last war, but how to prepare for the next one. And because American leaders believed the Soviet threat could emerge anywhere, they built forces capable of responding almost anywhere. This is one of the reasons the American military power became so unique. It was not just strong, it was scalable. It could fight a nuclear standoff in Europe, a naval crisis in the Pacific, a proxy war in the Middle East, and an insurgency in Southeast Asia sometimes, all within the same decade. Few states in history have sustained that kind of strategic flexibility for long. America did it by marrying military planning to economic endurance. That is another secret people often overlook. Power projection is expensive, very expensive. Aircraft carriers, global bases, airlift fleets, nuclear submarines, research programs, advanced jets, satellites, maintenance networks, training infrastructure, intelligence services, and standing armies all cost extraordinary sums. Many countries can build a military. Fewer can afford to keep one ready all the time. America could because its economy was vast enough to feed its ambition. The United States had factories, banks, energy, shipping, universities, private contractors, and a financial system that could support military competition year after year. This allowed Washington to outspend, outbuild, and outresearch many rivals. In the Cold War, that mattered enormously. Because the Soviet Union could build fearsome weapons, but America could often build more layers around those weapons. Better logistics, better support systems, better electronics, better training, better sustainment, better industrial replacement. In a long contest, that difference becomes decisive. But if the Cold War proved America's strategic genius in some areas, it also exposed its greatest weaknesses. Korea was one of the first tests. When Communist North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950, the United States moved quickly under a United Nations banner. American troops fought hard and pushed back the invasion, but the war soon became more complicated. China entered the conflict. The front lines shifted violently. Brutal fighting followed. In the end, the war settled into a bloody stalemate. America had prevented a communist takeover, but it had not achieved total victory. This was a warning. Military power could stop disaster, but it could not always create a clean political ending. That lesson would return with far greater force in Vietnam. Vietnam became one of the most painful contradictions in the history of American military power. On paper, the United States had overwhelming superiority. More aircraft, more artillery, better logistics, better firepower, better naval reach, better technology. And yet against guerrilla warfare, political complexity, jungle terrain, and a determined enemy willing to absorb immense punishment, all that superiority began to lose clarity. America could win battles, but still lose strategic momentum. It could destroy enemy formations, yet fail to control the political environment. It could dominate the skies and still not break the will of the adversary. Vietnam revealed a brutal truth. A military can be the strongest in the world and still struggle when the war itself refuses to behave like a conventional contest. This would become one of the recurring themes of American power. Dominance in open warfare did not always guarantee success in irregular warfare. Still, even after Vietnam, America did not collapse as a military power. It adapted. In fact, one of the reasons the United States remained so dangerous was its ability to learn from failure. The military studied what went wrong. It revised doctrine. It improved training. It focused more intensely on joint operations, battlefield communication, operational planning, and professional military education. This process of self-correction is one of the less dramatic but most important reasons for America's long military dominance. Great powers often become arrogant and stop learning. The United States has certainly had moments of arrogance, but it has also repeatedly invested in institutional learning. That made it harder to permanently weaken. Meanwhile, the Cold War battlefield was expanding into space and information. Satellites began changing war. Surveillance improved, communication improved, navigation improved, intelligence gathering improved. The military no longer depended only on maps, radios, and local observation. It was beginning to see the battlefield from above. This would eventually become one of the most revolutionary shifts in military history. America understood early that whoever controlled information could often shape the outcome before the shooting even began. So it invested not just in weapons, but in awareness. And awareness in war is often worth more than brute force. By the 1970s and 1980s, America was moving into another phase of military transformation. Precision began replacing mass. Quality began overtaking quantity. Better sensors, smarter munitions, stealth concepts, command integration, and advanced electronics were changing how war could be fought. The goal was no longer simply to have more firepower. The goal was to hit the right target at the right time with overwhelming effect, while exposing fewer American forces to danger. This was the birth of the military style that would later shock the world in the Gulf War. But before that moment arrived, the Cold War still had one final and dangerous chapter to play. The Soviet Union was weakening. Its economy was strained. Its political system was cracking. It was still armed, still nuclear, still dangerous, but the competition was becoming unsustainable. America had not won every war, and it had made grave mistakes. But in the long strategic contest, it had built something the Soviet system struggled to match. A military ecosystem backed by a stronger economy, deeper innovation, broader alliances, and more durable global reach. By the time the Cold War approached its end, the truth was becoming harder to ignore. The United States was not merely one of two superpowers anymore. It was preparing to become something even more extraordinary, and the sole military hyperpower of the modern age. But there was a catch. The collapse of one great rival would not end danger. It would create a more seductive threat: overconfidence. And overconfidence, as history repeatedly shows, can be more dangerous to empires than enemies themselves. The Cold War had taught America how to deter the end of the world. The next era would test whether it knew how to dominate a world that no longer had clear limits. And in that next chapter, American military power would reach heights so unmatched that many began to believe it had become untouchable. That belief would make the victories look dazzling. It would also make the coming mistakes far more costly. The Cold War did not end with one final battle, one last great explosion, or one dramatic surrender on a smoking battlefield. It ended with something more unsettling, one side slowly collapsing under the weight of its own exhaustion, while the other stood watching from the high ground. When the Soviet Union finally broke apart in 1991, the world entered a strange and unfamiliar moment. For nearly half a century, global politics had revolved around two armed titans staring at each other through missiles, tanks, submarines, spies, and fear. Then suddenly, one of those giants was gone, and what remained was not just a powerful country. What remained was the most militarily dominant state the modern world had ever seen standing alone. The United States had become the world's only true hyperpower. This was not just about having the biggest military budget. It was not just about having nuclear weapons, aircraft carriers, or overseas bases. It was about something much bigger and much more dangerous. America now possessed the ability to project organized violence almost anywhere on Earth, faster, farther, and more effectively than any other country alive. That level of military reach had never existed in human history on this scale. Old empires had controlled colonies. Great powers had maintained regional dominance. But America had built a system that could move fleets across oceans, launch aircraft from floating cities, deploy troops into deserts and mountains, strike targets from space-guided networks, and sustain war on the other side of the planet without collapsing under the strain. It was no longer just a strong nation. It was a military civilization with global operating capacity, and for a brief moment in history, it seemed almost unbeatable. But the world did not fully understand just how overwhelming American military superiority had become until the Gulf War. When Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, The crisis triggered a confrontation that would become one of the most important military demonstrations of the modern age. On paper, Iraq looked formidable. It had a large army, thousands of tanks, artillery, entrenched positions, and battle experience from its brutal war with Iran. Many expected a bloody and difficult campaign if the United States and its coalition allies tried to remove Iraqi forces. Some feared urban slaughter. Others feared a drawn-out regional disaster. But what happened instead stunned the world. America did not merely fight Iraq. It dismantled it with terrifying speed and precision. The air campaign came first. For weeks, American and Allied aircraft hammered Iraqi command centers, radar systems, air defenses, communication lines, supply depots, bridges, bunkers, and armored formations. This was not random bombing. This was modern war conducted with an intelligence-driven system that fused satellites, surveillance, targeting data, electronic warfare, and air superiority into a single crushing operation. The Iraqi military was not just being attacked. It was being blinded, isolated, confused, and hollowed out before the ground war even began. Then came the land offensive, and it was devastating. Coalition ground forces led by the United States swept through Iraqi positions with astonishing effectiveness. Tanks advanced with speed. Infantry moved under armored protection. Attack helicopters hunted exposed formations. Artillery shattered resistance. Air power continued striking from above. Units that had looked dangerous on paper were often overwhelmed before they could respond coherently. The war ended so quickly that it felt unreal. For many watching around the world, this was the moment they understood that war itself had changed. America was no longer simply fielding a larger army. It had mastered a new style of warfare based on information, precision, coordination, and speed. The Gulf War became a live demonstration of what happens when industrial power, Cold War research, satellite systems, advanced aircraft, professional training, logistics dominance, and joint operations all fuse into one battlefield machine. The message was impossible to miss. The United States was now operating on a level many others could not yet reach. This was the age of what some began calling the revolution in military affairs, though for ordinary people it looked simpler and more frightening. It looked like a military that could find you, hit you, and break your system before you even understood what was happening. Precision-guided munitions became symbols of this new Precision-guided munitions became symbols of this new era. Instead of dropping massive numbers of bombs and hoping enough of them hit the right area, America increasingly used weapons designed to strike specific targets with extraordinary accuracy. That meant command bunkers could be destroyed without flattening entire districts. Bridges could be dropped with surgical timing. Air defenses could be suppressed with less waste. Enemy movement could be disrupted with speed and intention. This did not make war clean, despite what some politicians like to suggest. War remained brutal, chaotic, and deeply human in its suffering. But it did mean that the United States could often apply force in a more focused and militarily efficient way than many previous powers, and that gave it a huge strategic edge. Yet the true foundation of this post-Cold War dominance was not one war. It was the architecture behind it. America's military superiority in the 1990s rested on a giant hidden structure most people never saw. Aircraft carriers did not operate alone. They depended on escort ships, submarines, replenishment vessels, maintenance systems, aviation fuel chains, and trained crews. Fighter jets did not simply appear in battle. They depended on air bases, spare parts, technicians, satellite communications, radar support, and munitions stockpiles. Ground forces did not move by magic. They depended on transport aircraft, sea lift capacity, prepositioned equipment, command planning, medical support, engineering units, and endless logistical coordination. This was where the United States truly separated itself from most of the world. It did not just own powerful weapons. It owned the systems that made those weapons usable at global scale. That difference is everything. Many states can purchase advanced hardware. Very few can integrate that hardware into a worldwide military ecosystem. America could. And it kept improving that ecosystem even after the Soviet Union vanished. Some people assumed the end of the Cold War would bring a peace dividend, a moment when the United States would dramatically reduce its military footprint and turn inward. That did happen in some areas. Force levels were adjusted, some budgets shifted, certain formations were reduced. But the larger strategic reality did not disappear. American leaders still believed the world needed to be shaped, stabilized, monitored, and if necessary, controlled through visible military presence. So instead of withdrawing from history, the United States stayed deeply embedded in it. Bases remained active across Europe and Asia. Naval patrols continued. Air superiority remained a priority. Intelligence operations expanded. Special operations forces grew more capable. Defense research pushed forward. Washington did not act like a country stepping away from power. It acted like a country trying to preserve a favorable global order before any new challenger could rise. And for a while, this worked. There was no near-peer military rival capable of matching American global reach. Russia, after the Soviet collapse, was weakened and disoriented. China was growing, but had not yet transformed itself into the strategic competitor it would later become. Europe was wealthy, but fragmented militarily. Regional powers could cause problems, but they could not truly rival Washington's worldwide capacity. This gave the United States an extraordinary degree of freedom. It could intervene in crises, enforce no-fly zones, launch punitive strikes, deploy peacekeeping missions, support allies, conduct covert operations, shape diplomatic negotiations from a position backed by force. This was not just military strength. It was strategic leverage at planetary scale. But there was a hidden danger inside this moment of supremacy. The more overwhelming American power appeared, the easier it became to believe that military superiority could solve almost any problem. And that belief, seductive and confident, would quietly plant the seeds of future disasters. Because defeating armies is one thing, reshaping nations is something else entirely. Even in the 1990s, warning signs existed. In Somalia, what began as a humanitarian and stabilization effort spiraled into violent urban confrontation. In the Balkans, military intervention helped stop atrocities and pressure outcomes, but it also showed how complex ethnic conflict, state collapse, and fractured legitimacy could be. Air power could coerce, troops could secure ground, but political reconstruction remained messy, fragile, and often incomplete. These were glimpses of a deeper truth. The American military was astonishingly good at destroying organized threats. It was not always equally effective at building stable peace after destruction. Still, those warnings were often overshadowed by the sheer spectacle of dominance. American aircraft carriers sailed like moving sovereign platforms. Stealth bombers symbolized futuristic reach. Special operations forces grew into elite instruments of rapid intervention. Satellite-guided warfare became more refined. Intelligence systems became more integrated. The military increasingly linked sensors, shooters, command centers, and communications into what looked almost like a nervous system for war. That nervous system mattered because modern conflict was becoming faster and more dependent on information. Whoever saw first often struck first. Whoever coordinated faster often won. Whoever could fuse data from air, land, sea, and space could often dominate before the enemy fully reacted. America was building that advantage year by year. The result was a military that did not merely rely on mass, but on awareness, tempo, and integration. This is one reason American power in the post-Cold War era looked so overwhelming. It was not just bigger. It was often operating inside the enemy's decision cycle. It could think, move, and hit faster than many opponents could organize themselves. And that is a terrifying advantage in war. Yet no empire escapes history forever. Beneath the triumph of the 1990s, something else was changing. Adversaries were watching. They were studying. They were asking themselves a deadly question. If the United States is unbeatable in conventional warfare, then how do you avoid fighting the kind of war it wants? This question would become one of the most important strategic developments of the modern age. Future enemies would not necessarily line up tank divisions in open desert and wait to be dismantled. They would disperse, hide, blend into cities, use militias, use insurgency, use propaganda, use cyber tools, use terrorism, use cheap missiles, use political fracture, use lawfare, use media, use asymmetry. In other words, they would look for the cracks in the giant rather than challenge its armor directly. But in the glow of post-Cold War supremacy, many in Washington believed the future would still belong mainly to speed, precision, air dominance, and technological superiority. And for conventional warfare, they were not wrong. The American military had reached a level of battlefield integration and strategic mobility that remained extraordinary. The problem was that the next great challenge would not arrive dressed in a conventional uniform. It would arrive through fire, shock, fear, and a collapse of assumptions. It would come on a clear morning when the world thought history had become safer. And when that moment came, the most powerful military on earth would discover that even unmatched strength can be forced into a kind of war it did not fully choose. The hyperpower age had made America look invincible. The next era would test whether invincibility was real or only an illusion made visible by the right kind of battlefield. Because power at its highest point often attracts not only admiration, but enemies willing to fight dirty, wait patiently, and bleed slowly if that is what it takes to drag the giant into the dark. And in the years ahead, that dark would spread from city skylines to desert roads, from hidden caves to crowded streets, from elite command rooms to ordinary homes across the world. The United States had mastered the art of global military dominance. What it had not yet fully mastered was the cost of being the one power everyone either feared, depended on, or wanted to wound. That cost was coming, and when it arrived, it would change the meaning of American military strength forever. If the world learned in the Gulf War that America had become the strongest military power on earth, the years that followed revealed something even more unsettling. The United States was no longer relying only on bigger armies, more tanks, or larger fleets. It was now building a military designed to see farther, move faster, strike cleaner, and disappear before the enemy could understand what had happened. This was the era when war itself began changing shape, and America stood at the center of that transformation. The battlefield was no longer just a stretch of land where soldiers met with rifles and artillery. It had become a web of satellites, code, sensors, stealth, surveillance, precision targeting, data links, electronic disruption, and command systems operating across continents. What made America so dangerous in this period was not simply the number of weapons it had, but the fact that those weapons were increasingly connected into one enormous nervous system of war. And once that system was awake, it became clear that the future of military dominance would belong not only to the side that could hit hardest, but to the side that could see, decide, and strike first. One of the most important weapons in this transformation was not a bomb or a missile. It was information. For centuries, commanders had fought partly blind. They relied on scouts, maps, intercepted messages, visual estimates, and delayed reports. Even great generals often acted with incomplete knowledge. But by the late 20th century, America was building something different. A military that could observe the battlefield in near real time. Satellites could track movement from space. Surveillance aircraft could scan large regions. Radar could detect incoming threats. Electronic intelligence could intercept signals. Drones, still in their earlier forms, began expanding the ability to watch without exposing pilots. This meant commanders no longer had to guess as much as their predecessors. They could build a moving picture of war, and in military affairs, knowledge is not just power, it is survival. The side that knows where the enemy is, what he is doing, and how fast he is moving often gains a deadly advantage before the shooting even starts. America understood this better than most. That is why it poured money, science, and doctrine into creating a force that did not merely fight hard but fought informed. This was also the age when stealth stopped being science fiction and became strategic reality. The idea of an aircraft slipping through enemy radar, entering defended airspace, striking critical targets, and escaping before a full response could be organized sounded almost unreal when first imagined. But the United States turned that imagination into battlefield fact. Stealth aircraft like the F-117 and later the B-2 Spirit represented something much bigger than engineering elegance. They represented a new military philosophy. If you can avoid detection, you can attack the enemy's nervous system before he can defend himself. That means command centers, radar sites, air defenses, communication hubs, and strategic infrastructure can be hit in the opening phase of war. The enemy does not just lose equipment, he loses coherence. He loses the ability to understand what is happening to him. This is why stealth mattered so much. It was not only about protecting pilots. It was about paralyzing the enemy's decision-making process. And once decision-making begins to collapse, even a large army can start behaving like a frightened crowd. But stealth alone would not have made America the military giant it became. Another revolution was happening at the same time: precision. In older wars, military power often depended on volume. More shells, more bombs, more planes, more destruction over larger areas. That kind of firepower could be devastating, but it was also inefficient and often blunt. Precision changed the equation. America increasingly developed weapons that could strike selected targets with extraordinary accuracy. Laser-guided bombs, GPS-guided munitions, cruise missiles, and advanced targeting systems meant that the United States could often destroy critical enemy assets with fewer platforms and less waste than before. That did not make war humane. It did not remove suffering. But it did make American operations more tactically efficient and strategically flexible. It allowed Washington to punish, deter, or intervene with a range of options that previous generations did not possess. A missile could be launched from hundreds of miles away. A bunker could be hit without sending waves of troops into direct danger. A moving target could be tracked and engaged with far more confidence than in earlier decades. Precision became one of the sharpest edges of American power. And because America also possessed the intelligence and surveillance network to feed that precision, the effect was multiplied. A smart weapon is only as good as the information guiding it. America increasingly had both. Then there was the sea. One of the least understood reasons for American military dominance is that the United States has long treated the oceans not as barriers but as highways of force. While many countries defend coastlines, America learned how to weaponize maritime mobility. Its aircraft carriers became floating air bases, symbols not just of prestige but of flexible, coercive power. A carrier strike group could move into a region without needing permission from a host country. It could launch aircraft, conduct surveillance, enforce presence, support allies, and if necessary, begin combat operations. Few military assets in history have combined visibility, flexibility, and intimidation quite like the American aircraft carrier. And the United States did not just have one. It had several backed by cruisers, destroyers, submarines, logistics ships, and naval aviation. This gave Washington a kind of mobile sovereignty. It could bring a piece of military America into troubled waters almost anywhere on Earth. Alongside carriers, American submarines represented another quiet but terrifying layer of dominance. Nuclear-powered submarines could remain underwater for long periods, stalk enemy vessels, gather intelligence, and in some cases carry strategic nuclear weapons capable of retaliation even after a catastrophic first strike. This mattered not only for warfighting, but for deterrence. The more hidden and survivable your retaliatory capability, the harder it is for an enemy to imagine defeating you. That is why the undersea dimension of American power remains one of its most important and least visible strengths. Then came the digital nervous system. As computing power expanded, the American military moved toward integrating battlefield information, communications, and command in ways that earlier armies could barely dream of. Commanders could receive updates faster. Units could coordinate across longer distances. Air, land, and sea operations could be synchronized more tightly. This was not perfect. No military system ever is. Confusion, delay, and friction never fully disappear. But compared to most of the world, the United States increasingly operated with a level of battlefield connectivity that made it unusually agile. This agility became one of the central pillars of American dominance. It meant the military could adapt, redirect, and exploit opportunities quickly. In war, speed is often not just about movement. It is about comprehension. If you can understand the battle faster than the enemy, you can shape it before he catches up. America was getting very good at that. And still, the revolution was not over. Special operations forces began taking on a larger role in the American military toolkit. Elite units trained for direct action, reconnaissance, hostage rescue, unconventional warfare, and counterterrorism became increasingly important in a world where threats were not always large armies wearing standard uniforms. These forces offered something that large conventional formations often could not: precision human action in politically sensitive and operationally complex environments. They could move quietly, gather intelligence, strike specific targets, train local partners, and operate in the shadows between war and peace. In the decades ahead, these units would become some of the most frequently used instruments of American military power. But during this period, they were still part of a broader evolution: the shift from mass industrial war to integrated high-technology war. Yet for all this innovation, there was always a dangerous temptation inside the American system: the belief that technology could solve the deepest problems of war. This belief was understandable. When your aircraft can evade radar, your missiles can strike with remarkable accuracy, your satellites can see from orbit, and your command networks can coordinate global operations. It becomes easy to imagine that future conflict can be controlled through superior systems. It becomes easy to believe that the side with the best machines will always dictate the terms. And in some forms of war, that belief seems almost true. Against many conventional adversaries, American military technology created overwhelming asymmetry. But war has a cruel habit of humiliating certainty. Because not every enemy wants to fight on open terms. Not every battlefield rewards high-tech dominance in the same way. And not every strategic problem can be solved by destroying targets. This would become painfully clear in the next era. Before that reckoning came, however, America's military transformation reached another major threshold: global strike capability. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the United States had built an extraordinary ability to hit targets across the world with speed and flexibility. Bombers could launch from the continental United States and strike distant theaters. Cruise missiles could be fired from ships and submarines. Carrier aviation could sustain regional operations. Long-range transport aircraft could move troops and equipment rapidly. Intelligence networks could identify emerging threats in places many Americans could barely locate on a map. The result was a military posture, unlike anything previous empires had possessed. The United States did not need to conquer territory in the old colonial style to exert force. It could influence events through presence, mobility, and selective violence. This gave Washington enormous strategic options. But it also created a trap. The easier it becomes to use force, the more often leaders may be tempted to believe force is the answer. This is one of the hidden paradoxes of American military superiority. Its effectiveness sometimes made intervention look simpler than it truly was. And once intervention begins, the battlefield often rewrites the plan. That is exactly what happened when the world changed on a clear September morning. Until that moment, many believed the greatest threats to American security would continue to come from hostile states, regional aggressors, or strategic competitors. But the next major attack on the United States did not come from a tank army or a missile barrage. It came from a small network of determined extremists who used civilian aircraft as weapons and shattered the illusion that distance alone could protect the American homeland. The attacks of September 11th did more than kill thousands. They changed the direction of American military power. Suddenly, the most advanced war machine in history was being drawn into a different kind of struggle, one against networks, ideology, hidden cells, safe havens, and enemies who did not need to defeat the United States in open battle to wound it deeply. All the satellites and stealth bombers, precision missiles, and carrier groups in the world could destroy camps, compounds, and governments. But could they defeat an enemy that dispersed into mountains, cities, villages, and belief systems? Could they create political order after invasion? Could they prevent small groups from turning patience into strategic leverage? These questions would soon dominate the next phase of American military history. And for the first time in decades, the world would begin to see that even the strongest military on Earth can find itself pulled into wars where victory is easy to announce but hard to define. The invisible weapons had changed war forever, yes, but they had not changed one ancient truth. The battlefield still belongs not only to the side with the best tools, but to the side that understands what kind of war it is truly fighting. America was about to learn that lesson in the hardest way possible. When the smoke rose over New York and Washington on September 11th, the United States did not respond like a wounded nation searching for patience. It responded like a giant that had just been struck in its own home, and that giant was furious. In the hours after the attacks, fear turned into resolve, and resolve turned into war. The strongest military power on Earth was about to unleash itself against enemies that had not attacked with tanks, warships, or fighter jets, but with planning, fanaticism, and ruthless imagination. This was a different kind of war from anything America had prepared for during most of the Cold War. It was not a contest for Europe. It was not a desert showdown like the Gulf War. It was not a conventional invasion by a rival state. It was a war against networks, ideology, hidden sanctuaries, and men who wanted to drag the United States into endless conflict on unfamiliar ground. At first, America looked unstoppable. In Afghanistan, the Taliban government had sheltered al-Qaeda, the group responsible for the attacks. So Washington moved fast. Working with intelligence services, special operations forces, air power, and local anti-Taliban fighters, the United States launched a campaign that quickly shattered Taliban control of major cities. It was a dramatic display of the new American way of war. Small elite teams on the ground linked to overwhelming air power, working alongside local partners to collapse an enemy government with speed. The Taliban fell from power faster than many expected. To much of the world, it looked like another example of what happened when America focused its full military attention on a target. But the first victory hid the first trap. Removing a regime is one thing. Building a stable political order after its collapse is something far more difficult. Once the Taliban were pushed aside, Afghanistan did not transform into a neat, democratic success story. It remained what it had long been, a deeply fractured land shaped by tribal loyalties, regional power brokers, rugged geography, corruption, external interference, warlord politics, and generations of conflict. The United States had defeated the enemy's visible structure, but not the deeper conditions that allowed insurgency to survive. The Taliban did not vanish. They adapted. They melted into villages, mountains, cross-border sanctuaries, and waiting networks. They stopped fighting like a government and started fighting like a patient wound. This was the central problem of the coming era. America's military was built to dominate organized enemies with speed and precision. But insurgencies do not always offer themselves as clean targets. They hide among civilians. They strike when conditions favor them. They survive by avoiding decisive battle. They understand that time itself can be a weapon. If they cannot defeat a superpower in open combat, they can try to exhaust its patience, its money, its political will, and its public confidence. The Taliban understood this. So did many others. Then came Iraq, and with it, one of the most consequential decisions in modern American military history. In 2003, the United States invaded Saddam Hussein's regime. The public arguments were many. Weapons of mass destruction, security fears, regime danger, post-September 11th urgency, and a broader desire to reshape the Middle East. But whatever the stated justifications, the military result at first looked brutally familiar. America crushed the Iraqi military with astonishing speed. Baghdad fell. Saddam's regime collapsed. The opening campaign once again seemed to prove that no conventional military in the region could stand against the United States. The invasion reinforced the image of American battlefield dominance. But beneath the fast victory, a political earthquake had begun. The destruction of the Iraqi state apparatus, the disbanding of parts of the military structure, the breakdown of security, the rise of sectarian tensions, the growth of insurgent networks, and the vacuum created by regime collapse turned Iraq into a furnace of chaos. America had won the invasion and stumbled into the occupation. That distinction would haunt the war for years. Suddenly, the battlefield was no longer about destroying armored divisions in open terrain. It was about roadside bombs, hidden cells, urban ambushes, sectarian militias, intelligence failures, shifting alliances, and a population caught between fear, resentment, and survival. The strongest military on earth was now fighting enemies who did not need to defeat it conventionally. They only needed to make the war feel endless, expensive, and politically corrosive. And they were learning quickly. Improvised explosive devices became one of the most symbolic weapons of the era. Cheap, hidden, deadly, and psychologically exhausting, they represented the ugly logic of asymmetry. America could deploy billion-dollar systems, satellite-guided bombs, advanced armor, elite infantry, drones, and massive support structures. The insurgent could bury a homemade explosive in a road and force a superpower to spend millions trying to survive a threat that cost almost nothing to create. This was not because American power had vanished, was because war had shifted into a domain where cost, visibility, and initiative did not always favor the technologically superior side. The United States adapted in many ways. It improved armor protection. It refined counterinsurgency doctrine. It increased intelligence fusion. It expanded drone surveillance. It adjusted patrol tactics. It worked more deeply with local forces. It used special operations units with increasing intensity. It invested in battlefield medicine, route clearance, electronic jamming, and population-focused security strategies. In many tactical areas, the American military showed remarkable resilience and learning. This matters because one of the most misunderstood truths about these wars is that the United States did not fail because its soldiers or officers were incapable. In many cases, they performed with extraordinary discipline, adaptability, and courage under impossible conditions. The deeper problem was strategic. Military power was being asked to solve political fractures, social breakdown, state collapse, and ideological insurgency all at once. That is a burden even the strongest armed force can struggle to carry. This is one of the great lessons of the American military story. Power can destroy, power can occupy, power can intimidate, power can protect. But power alone cannot always create legitimacy, and without legitimacy, military success often starts leaking away no matter how many tactical victories are achieved. In both Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States repeatedly found itself confronting this painful reality. It could clear territory, only to watch instability return. It could kill dangerous leaders, only to see replacements emerge. It could train local forces, only to find some units hollowed out by corruption, fear, factionalism, or weak institutions. It could pour in resources, only to discover that money without political coherence can deepen dysfunction rather than cure it. These wars became strategic mazes. Every gain carried hidden fragility. Every apparent breakthrough risked reversal. And because America's military remained so capable at the tactical and operational level, it often kept the wars going rather than allowing them to collapse into a quick reckoning. This is one of the paradoxes of overwhelming military superiority. It can prolong conflict by preventing outright defeat while also failing to deliver clean victory. The machine keeps functioning, but the destination keeps moving. At the same time, the wars after September 11th transformed parts of the American military in lasting ways. Drones became central tools of surveillance and targeted strikes. Counterterrorism operations expanded globally. Special operations forces reached an unprecedented level of strategic importance. Intelligence agencies and military commands fused their activities more tightly. Precision strike capabilities improved even further. Battlefield networking became more refined. Real-time targeting and data sharing advanced dramatically. In this sense, the wars were not only drains, they were also laboratories. America was learning how to hunt dispersed enemies across multiple countries using a blend of intelligence, technology, and selective force. This would shape its military methods for years to come. Yet every adaptation carried moral, political, and strategic costs. Drone warfare raised difficult questions about civilian casualties, sovereignty, accountability, and the psychological distance between decision-makers and the violence they authorized. Detention policies and torture scandals damaged America's image and credibility. Civilian suffering in war zones created anger and mistrust. The long duration of the conflicts drained public patience at home. The cost in blood, trauma, and treasure became staggering. Families carried the burden. Veterans carried the burden. Entire societies carried the burden. The military remained powerful, but the nation was learning that being able to fight indefinitely does not mean one should. Then came one of the most dramatic symbols of this era's contradictions, the raid that killed Osama bin Laden. In 2011, American Special Operations Forces entered Pakistan in a secret mission and killed the man whose attacks had helped trigger the entire post-September 11th war. It was a remarkable demonstration of American intelligence integration, operational planning, stealth capability, and elite force execution. It showed that even after years of frustration, the United States could still reach deep into hostile or politically sensitive environments and strike with precision. But even that dramatic success could not erase the larger strategic dilemma. One man had been found and killed. The wider wars remained unresolved. This is what made the post-September 11th era so important to understanding American military power. It proved two things at once, both of them true and both of them uncomfortable. First, the United States remained the most capable military force in the world. It could invade, strike, surveil, transport, coordinate, and sustain operations at a scale no rival insurgent force could match. Second, even that level of capability could not guarantee political control over complex societies shattered by war, ideology, corruption, and fractured legitimacy. This is not a small lesson. It is one of the most important strategic truths of the modern era. A nation can be unmatched in military strength and still find itself trapped in wars where the enemy's goal is not to win conventionally, but to outlast. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, America was increasingly trying to shift away from the era of endless counterinsurgency. Afghanistan, after 2 decades of war, ended in a deeply painful and chaotic withdrawal. The Taliban returned to power, a bitter reminder that battlefield superiority does not automatically produce durable political outcomes. Iraq, though changed and partially stabilized in some periods, remained scarred by invasion, insurgency, sectarianism, and regional power struggles. Across the wider region, the consequences of intervention and instability continued echoing. And while the United States had spent years hunting terrorists and insurgents, something else had been happening quietly in the background. Bigger rivals were watching. China was studying. Russia was recalculating. They were learning from every American strength and every American vulnerability. They saw the brilliance of American logistics, strike capability, joint operations, stealth, intelligence, and global reach. But they also saw something else. They saw that even the strongest military in the world could be drawn into long, costly, politically exhausting wars that consumed attention and resources. They saw that time, adaptation, and asymmetry could complicate American power. And they began preparing for the next era accordingly. That next era would not look exactly like Iraq or Afghanistan. It would be broader, colder, more technological, and in some ways even more dangerous. It would involve drones, cyber warfare, space assets, disinformation, anti-ship missiles, gray zone conflict, strategic competition, and the return of major power rivalry. The age of chasing insurgents had not ended cleanly, but a new strategic contest was already rising behind it. And in that contest, the United States would have to prove not only that it could fight terrorists in deserts and mountains, but that it could still deter and outmatch powerful states, preparing carefully for the day they might have to challenge the giant directly. The wars after September 11th had shown the world something unforgettable. America was still the strongest military power on Earth, but strength, no matter how immense, was not the same as control. And once a superpower forgets that difference, history has a way of reminding it in blood, money, time, and silence. After everything, the wars, the victories, the humiliations, the inventions, the hidden operations, the giant budgets, the carrier fleets, the nuclear submarines, the stealth aircraft, the failed occupations, the satellite networks, the drone age, the cyber battles, and the return of dangerous rivals, we now arrive at the question that sits at the center of this entire story. Is America still the strongest military power on Earth today? The short answer is yes. But the full answer is far more suspenseful and far more dangerous than many people are willing to admit. Because strength in war is not only about who looks the biggest, it is about who can fight, who can sustain, who can adapt, who can project power, who can recover from shocks, and who can still impose military consequences on any enemy in a crisis. And when you judge America by those standards, it remains in a class of its own, though not without warning signs that history is already beginning to whisper. Start with the most obvious fact. No country on Earth can currently match the full combination of American military reach, industrial depth, alliance power, technological sophistication, naval mobility, strategic lift, and battlefield integration. Many countries have powerful armies. Some have dangerous missile forces. A few have major navies. A handful possess nuclear arsenals. But the United States still remains the one military power that can fight across multiple domains, air, land, sea, space, cyber, and intelligence, while also sustaining operations globally over long periods. That matters more than most people understand. A military is not truly powerful just because it owns deadly weapons. It is powerful when those weapons can be moved, maintained, coordinated, protected, replenished, and politically supported in real conflict. That is where America still holds an extraordinary advantage. It has aircraft carriers that can function like floating air bases. It has strategic bombers that can strike from great distances. It has transport aircraft that can move forces and equipment around the world faster than almost any rival. It has military satellites, undersea deterrence, overseas bases, command structures, and alliance relationships that multiply its options in war. And perhaps most importantly, it still has the habit of thinking about war at global scale. That habit is rare. Most countries prepare for regional defense or limited contingencies. America prepares for planetary responsibility, whether wisely or unwisely, and that difference is enormous. It means the United States is not simply defending itself. It is maintaining a military posture built to shape events far beyond its own borders. That is why its armed forces still appear so unmatched in many categories. Consider air power. No other country combines America's scale of combat aviation, aerial refueling, stealth capacity, airborne surveillance, pilot training, and support infrastructure in the same way. The United States does not merely own fighter jets, it owns the wider ecosystem that allows those jets to operate at range and at tempo. That includes tankers, maintenance crews, spare parts networks, munition stockpiles, hardened procedures, intelligence feeds, and command integration. The same is true at sea. Aircraft carriers alone are not enough. What makes American naval power so formidable is the system around the carriers, escorts, submarines, logistics, naval aviation, and doctrine built over generations. Even today, if a crisis erupts in multiple regions, the United States remains one of the very few countries capable of bringing sustained maritime air power into the equation quickly. Then there is the nuclear dimension. America still possesses one of the most powerful and survivable nuclear deterrents in the world. Its land-based missiles, strategic bombers, and ballistic missile submarines form a triad designed to ensure that no enemy can destroy America's retaliatory capability in one blow. This matters because, in a world with other nuclear powers, military dominance cannot be judged only by conventional weapons. It must also include strategic deterrence. And in that category, the United States remains central to the balance of fear that still shapes modern geopolitics. But here is where the suspense deepens. Being the strongest military power in the world today does not mean America can do whatever it wants without consequence. It does not mean it can easily win every war. It does not mean it can impose its will cheaply. And it certainly does not mean its dominance is as effortless as it may have looked in the years after the Cold War. The battlefield has changed. Rivals have changed. Technology has spread. Vulnerabilities have multiplied. The margin of superiority, while still real, is no longer wrapped in the same illusion of invulnerability. China is the clearest sign of that shift. For the first time since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States faces a rival with the industrial scale, technological ambition, strategic patience, and military modernization drive to pose a serious long-term challenge. China still does not possess America's full global military reach, but it does not necessarily need to. Its strategy is more focused and more regionally dangerous. It aims to make key areas, especially the Western Pacific, more difficult and more costly for American intervention. That means in a future conflict near Taiwan or elsewhere in East Asia, the United States would not be operating in a carefree environment. It would be entering a contested zone where missiles, drones, cyber attacks, submarines, electronic warfare, and mass sensors could create serious friction from the opening hours. That does not mean China would automatically win. Far from it. But it does mean America's superiority would be tested under conditions far more dangerous than those of the post-Cold War interventions. Russia, despite its limitations and failures, also remains a reminder that military danger is not always measured by elegant efficiency alone. A country can be economically weaker and still remain strategically disruptive through missiles, nuclear weapons, hybrid tactics, cyber operations, and willingness to absorb pain. North Korea remains heavily armed and unpredictable. Iran continues to rely on regional networks, missiles, drones, and asymmetry. Non-state actors remain capable of surprise. Terror networks mutate rather than vanish. In short, America still sits at the top of the military hierarchy, but the world beneath it has become more unstable, more inventive, and more hostile to easy dominance. Another challenge is industrial resilience. This may sound less exciting than fighter jets and warships, but it is one of the most important military questions of our time. Can the United States still produce enough munitions, spare parts, ships, advanced systems, and replacement capacity quickly enough in a prolonged major conflict? For decades, America's military superiority benefited from a huge industrial base and relatively unchallenged logistics. But modern high-intensity warfare can consume weapons at frightening speed. Missiles, artillery shells, drones, precision munitions, interceptors, and maintenance parts can disappear faster than peacetime assumptions often expect. This means that military strength in the future may depend not only on who has the most advanced systems on day one, but on who can keep building and sustaining under pressure on day 30, day 90, and day 300. America is still powerful here, but it has had to confront uncomfortable questions about production capacity, supply chains, shipbuilding speed, and dependence on complex industrial networks. Great powers are not defeated only by battlefield mistakes. Sometimes they are weakened by the slow rust of overconfidence. There is also the issue of internal endurance. This is the part military analysts sometimes hesitate to say out loud, but it matters deeply. A military is not separate from the society behind it. It depends on political will, social trust, economic health, institutional competence, recruitment quality, civil-military balance, and national focus. America remains immensely capable, but it also carries internal polarization, political division, and periods of strategic inconsistency that rivals can exploit. If a nation cannot agree on what it is willing to defend, how long it is willing to endure sacrifice, or what kind of world it wants to shape, even the strongest military can find itself strategically constrained. This does not mean the United States is collapsing. That claim is often exaggerated. But it does mean that military power must always be understood as part of a larger national organism. Weapons alone do not create durable strength. Coherence does. And coherence is harder to maintain in a noisy, divided, hyperconnected age. Still, when all these cautions are taken seriously, the final balance remains clear. America is still the strongest military power in the world today because no rival yet combines so many strengths at once. Its defense spending remains enormous. Its alliance network remains unmatched. Its Navy still dominates blue water operations. Its air power remains elite. Its undersea force remains deeply feared. Its intelligence architecture is vast. Its military universities and professional planning institutions remain among the most developed on Earth. Its innovation ecosystem, despite competition, still gives it major advantages in advanced systems, software integration, and operational adaptation. And perhaps most importantly, it has decades of real-world combat experience across multiple types of conflict: conventional war, counterinsurgency, maritime operations, strategic deterrence, special operations, coalition warfare, and global logistics. That accumulated experience is not perfect, and it has sometimes been learned through painful failure. But it still matters. A military that has been tested repeatedly often carries instincts and lessons that paper strength alone cannot provide. So yes, the United States remains the strongest military power in the world, from the furnace of 1942 to the dangerous present day. But the meaning of that strength has changed. In the Second World War, it meant industrial mobilization and total war. In the Cold War, it meant deterrence, containment, and technological competition. In the unipolar moment, it meant global dominance and rapid intervention. In the age after September 11th, it meant immense power colliding with insurgency and political complexity. And now, in this new era, it means something more fragile and more suspenseful. Maintaining superiority in a world where enemies have had decades to study the giant and sharpen knives for the places where its armor is thinner than it appears. That is the real ending of this story. America did not become the strongest military power in the world by accident. It became that power through industry, money, science, geography, alliances, adaptation, logistics, doctrine, and ruthless historical timing. But history never gives any empire a permanent throne. Every dominant power eventually faces the same question: can it still think as clearly as it once fought? Because the future will not only belong to the strongest military, it will belong to the power that understands what kind of wars are coming before those wars arrive. And if America forgets that, then even the greatest military machine in modern history may one day discover that supremacy is not something you inherit forever. It is something you must keep earning, one generation at a time. While the whole world watches, waits, and prepares for the moment, you finally make a mistake too large to hide. Welcome to America Hidden History. Before you go, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, and your country. And if you have not yet subscribed, please subscribe, like this video, and support our channel.